in Scotland. And apparently it's recording in progress, which is very good news for everyone. We want to welcome you to this very special webinar, Common Ground, where we explore how Europe can be and is the uniting factor across the political divide in Scotland. And now, first, I want to thank all of you for coming and welcome in particular our new members who join us from UK and are now full members of EMiS. If you're not a member of our organization, please join. Details are on our website. And if you are a member or if you're not a member, we depend on funding to keep ourselves going. So please do help us. You can find donation details again on our website. Now, again, my first duty tonight is actually to apologize to you all. In the European movement in Scotland, we aim to bring people from diverse backgrounds with challenging perspectives to the debate, and our aim is always to have diverse panels. Unfortunately for tonight's debate, given that we have a male president, David, and a male vice president, Alyn, on the panel, it would have been desirable to have one of our female members of the officer board chairing tonight, but unfortunately none were available. So I'm afraid you're all stuck with me, but not for long, because rather than give a Wikipedia-inspired biography of our two guests, I'm going to invite them in a second to introduce themselves in the discussion, and they can talk about their background and how they came to have their senior roles in Europe. But quickly, before I do that, just let me say that I'm planning to have this conversation maybe run, we put down an hour and a half. We'll see how it goes, but maybe an hour and a quarter. We'll continue on if there's huge demand. And also we're going to start with a chat between myself, David, and Alyn, and then we'll go to questions that can come in, I think, there's a Q&A section on Zoom, and also you can go to the chat, and hopefully I'll be able to track all the questions there. So I'm going to go straight now to our wonderful and generous panelists, David Martin and Alyn Smith. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you. My first question, as I say, I wasn't going to give a biography. I was going to ask both of you. I think, David, I'll start with you. Just, what, your road to Europe from an early age. Tell me how did you come to, have such a belief and a love for Europe?
Oh, so an interesting question to which there's no easy answer, but my first kind of contact with Europe, bizarrely, well, it now seems bizarre, was actually on the passenger seat of a Scottish and Newcastle brewery delivery lorry going from Edinburgh to Brussels. And my dad worked for Scottish and Newcastle breweries, and quite legitimately and legally in those days, I'm sure it's not allowed nowadays, for 10 bob, 50p, you could actually pay the insurance and sit beside the driver, who welcomed the fact he got company in his travels, and go wherever the driver was going. And just a kind of additional bizarre point of that story, the beer we were delivering was actually called Martin's, but absolutely no relation to me, unfortunately. But that kind of introduced me to Brussels. I was always brought up at school with Edinburgh being the three Bs: banking, business, and brewing. And I kind of thought we almost had a stranglehold over that. And I was astonished when I arrived in Brussels to find a variety of beers and all the rest of it, and to find it on the continent they drank beer. I just assumed it was a kind of wine drinking place. So that was kind of my introduction. And it gave me both an interest in Europe, but also a lifelong interest in traveling. And as since then I became an MEP. I've spent half my life as an MEP, and probably very similar to Alyn, different ages, so slightly different lengths of time, but we've probably both spent almost half our lives as members of the European Parliament. The story about becoming an MEP, I have to say, is less, if I'm absolutely honest, less inspiring. I had become a Lothian Regional Councillor when I was still at university, and I realised it was going to be quite difficult to get a job while you were a councillor. In those days, there's no chance of being a full-time councillor, permanent full-time councillor. So I realised I had to either get permanent in politics, which by then I had absolutely fallen in love with as well, or get out of politics. And I'm sorry, the uninspiring fact is the European seat came along first and ended up becoming a European MEP. but again, immediately started to enjoy European politics, and thereafter saw no desire to go back to British politics.
Yeah, and you did tell me, didn't you, that in a very kind of like Nigel Farage type move, you gave up learning French in
Yeah,
your teenage years.
that was one of my greatest regrets. Again, I went to Liberton High School in Edinburgh, and at the end of second year, like every other kid, you chose your subjects for O grades, and I chose 8 subjects. At the end of third year, they said the timetable couldn't accommodate doing 8 subjects, so I had to drop a subject. And yeah, sadly, because I never thought it'd actually be any use to me, I dropped French, which is now a big regret, I have to tell you.
Well, Alyn, I mean, are you a polyglot? How did you? What was your first impressions of Europe?
Well, it's fascinating how everybody finds their way to get here, and that's where I think the European movement's a great big tent of people who come from all perspectives, and we're all on a journey one way or another. I mean, I kind of got there by accident in that I grew up in Saudi Arabia. My dad was a builder; he's just retired. He was a quantity surveyor, and they've just retired from Kuwait. 1979, same as the rest of the building trade, he was made redundant. So we spent much of the 80s in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. So we were Western, never mind European, with a vague sense of where we were from, but no particular attachment. And got back to Glasgow in the late 80s and was silent for the best part of a couple of hours once the plane had actually landed. My opening line was, "Why is the sky so low? Why does anybody live in this place? This is appalling." And that was kind of my attitude for quite a while. The big thing for Europe for me was when I was a student, I was doing law and European law at Leeds University, and I did my middle year in Heidelberg on Erasmus. And that was where things changed. That was where you can, yeah, it's always retrospectively, you can see it. But that was where I was exposed to all sorts of other stuff that was going on. Like David discovering that Europeans drank beer. I remember having an argument with a Swiss student telling him that Calvin was a Scottish name, because it's a very Scottish name. Come on. We hadn't quite actually put it all together that, yeah, they had something to do with that first. And then I did a master's at the College of Europe. It was the new campus that was being opened up. The College of Europe's based in Bruges, but they just opened up a Warsaw campus. The new incoming democratic Polish government had gifted them the old Politburo's hunting dacha to the south of Warsaw, and we were the first year to go. So it was not long after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was exciting. It was all of these countries that in my complete ignorance, I just thought were all just red and basically the same. And they'd all regained their independence. And that was a scary prospect for a lot of people. There was a lot of people who were very anxious about it. The economy was in all sorts of shape. Poland was undergoing shock therapy as I was there. And all of my professors were ministers in the Polish government or opposition and the real practitioners. And then, as many students of the College of Europe do, ended up in Brussels for a spell working for Scotland Europa. And it was there that my connection to domestic politics more crystallized. I'd always been small n nat, proudly Scottish, but not necessarily seeing the politics of it. Because remember, before there was a Scottish Parliament, there wasn't really a way of expressing that. And 1997, when I was a lawyer, I enthusiastically voted Labour for Tony Blair and the incoming UK Labour government, because there was a plan, there was an exciting set of prospects. But it was in Brussels that my nationalism crystallised, that Scotland has got the resources that many of the countries out here, Slovenia, Slovakia, the Baltic states, we've got resources that they would and still would give their eye teeth for. But having regained their independence, that was something I said, well, yeah, my country wants a bit of that as well. So that was where I joined the SNP and the political track started. But I started in Europe rather than the other way around.
Okay. I mean, I got to, in some ways, I've got a confession, you know, that kind of, that ignorance we're talking about Europe. My English mum, I remember when she sent me off, you know, I'm going to blame the English here. My English mum sent me off on my exchange to France, and she said that I had to ask, this is when I was 16, so in the 80s, said I had to ask whether the water was drinkable. And I remember just, my French exchange family kind of rolling around the floor laughing at this Irish guy coming over asking, was the water drinkable? But we did have that. There was, it was quite a niche kind of interest, I suppose, wasn't it originally, David? It wasn't, we've always had that thing in the UK and in Ireland as well, but in the UK, that Europe kind of doesn't have much to do with us.
There was for a long time that Europe was kind of over there and we were, this island on its own. But I think that changed quite a long time ago. I don't think that's been a perspective for most of my lifetime, actually. I think as I reached kind of adulthood in my early 20s, I think there was a growing interest in Europe. And it was one of the things that, I'm not a Marxist, but I do like some of his ideas. And one of the things when I was selected to be an MEP, one of the things I said at my selection was, Marx said, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And if you look around, it's the multinational companies that have united, not the workers. And that was one of my driving interests in getting involved in the European Union, that this was a chance to put the case for the working people at the European Union level, because in the 70s and the 80s, it was very much bureaucratic, if you like, a bureaucratic organization designed to facilitate business and not much else.
Okay, well, actually, let's go into, because we said we'd go into then, the journey into politics. So David, your experience. When we spoke beforehand, you said that Westminster had this. I love this, that kind of yaboo politics that you didn't experience really when you went over to Brussels. Is that right?
Yeah, arriving as an MEP was a shock to kind of my way of politically operating. It's not just Westminster. I was on, as I mentioned, when I was elected to European Parliament, I was a member of the Lothian Regional Council. And at that time, it had 49 members, 23 Conservatives, 23 Labour, 3 Lib Dem / SDP, 1 Nationalist and 1 Independent. And it was very much set up as Westminster, the governing party, which was the Conservatives, us, the opposition here, and it was yaboo. We shouted at them and they shouted at us. Everything they did was wrong and everything we suggested was wrong. And it was a confrontational setup, just like Westminster. And arrive in the European Parliament, you discover that if you're going to have any impact at all, you have to learn to work across party, to build consensus, to cooperate with your opposition or people from another party. And that was a big, steep learning curve for me, but one I enjoyed. And one of the things that I still find difficult to get across to people at home, is that's hard politics. The easy politics is actually the yaboo. If somebody says black and you say white, you can go on all day and that's fine. If you have to try and find compromise, if you have to try and find a way forward, that is difficult politics. And it's one of the things I most enjoyed about the European Parliament, actually, was finding solutions to difficult problems across both nationalities and political views.
Alyn, did you find was it a bit of a surprise to you, coming from more confrontational politics here, to go across and to have this more consensual or seeking to find consensus?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what David's saying about actually trying to find common ground is harder. If you just want to dig trenches and throw stuff at each other and call each other names, then that's easy. But it doesn't actually take anybody anywhere, and it's actually quite boring as well. I went through a steep learning curve when I was first elected into Brussels, then I was elected into Westminster, so I went from the sublime to the ridiculous. And even particularly in the Parliament that we just had, where it was Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Brexit, flat earthers denying the evidence in front of them, it was a gruesome experience. And I laid on pretty thick that I'm Mr. Middle of the Road. I'll try and work with anybody. I'll try and agree. I'll try and disagree agreeably. I'll try and find common ground. And the amount of times I'd get the opponents coming up after the speech saying, oh, you were very good there. Yes, very sensible. Of course, I'm not voting for any of it. Of course you're not. Because that's not how Westminster works. And I think that's where, and it sounds really anarchy, but proportional systems of government change the relationship between politicians and the voters. Because as we have been today, I've been out knocking doors in the Stirling East by-election, which is happening as we speak. And because it's proportionate, so well, okay, you might not be SNP in my case, or Labour in David's case, or Tory in another case, whatever. But what about your second choice? What about your third choice? And then in first past the post, if you're voting for me, you're my best friend. If you're not voting for me, I don't greatly care. Now I was elected into Stirling with 51% of the vote, so I actually had a majority, which I then lost at the last election. But so many of the colleagues at Westminster would talk about their majority, but it was actually just how much did you beat the other guy by? And that, I think, encourages the concept of safe seats, which in a democracy is surely just nonsense. That encourages a cynicism within the electorate. And that's where I think we saw in the independence referendum in 2014 and then the EU referendum as well on a bigger scale UK-wide in 2016. People who'd been shut out the democratic process because it was all just rubbish for 20, 30 years checked back in. And they didn't check back in to endorse the status quo. They checked back in to shake things up a bit, which was why the Leave campaign was able to tap into that take back control. Because I think first past the post is an appalling way of electing anybody. And I think it delivers a bad politics. I think it accentuates minor swings. The majority that the UK Labour government has right now is artificially inflated in the same way as the SNP's representation for Scotland was artificially inflated in 2015. That leads to wildly differing expectations than the reality on the ground. But that whole point that politics has to be about finding solutions and finding that place where you agree. I mean, my experience is I can deal with pretty much anybody of any politics, and there's 20% over there we're not going to agree on. There's 20% over there we won't agree on. But then there's this 60% in the middle where actually we broadly agree, and the challenge is to get something done. And that's where so much of UK politics lately has just not been about that. And that's where I think a more European ethos would be useful for all of us.
Yeah, and in some ways, David, I mean, like that behoves, I mean, really us, I like to think of us all as, a nice liberal bunch here, but we have to, sometimes step out the ivory tower and work with people that we might not agree a huge amount on, but we agree with some things on. I mean, that's quite an important part of it, David, really, isn't it? Reaching across the aisle.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, there's a limit to that, to be honest, where people believe in the democratic process and support the democratic process, then I'm happy to work with them. As Alyn's indicated, there's quite often areas where you'll never agree on, but that's life. But if you can find common ground, you find common ground. And if you look at the current European Parliament, I would find it very difficult to work with this new group called the Patriots, which I don't really believe they believe in the democratic process. But even Maloney's party, which has been called a fascist party and have no time for their wider politics, I could understand how people might feel they could work with them, because I think they probably do, maybe but they do support the democratic process. So that's probably about as far as I could go that way. And similarly with the left, as long as they believe, even the hard left, as long as they believe in the democratic process, then you're happy to work with them. One of the curious things I found in terms of cooperation, and I think, but my memory is not brilliant, I think this might have been 5 years before Alyn arrived, but in 84 to 99, the European Parliament had Scotland had 8 seats in the European Parliament, all separate. And we were not rivals in that sense, because I stood in the Lothians, somebody standing in Strathclyde West was not trying to get my seat. So you would have thought cooperation would be good. But it wasn't. Some of that might have been personality. But one of the strange things is, when we all started representing Scotland in 1999, when we were competing for the same votes, actually cooperation became much greater. And I was thinking just before it came on air, of trying to think of an example of this. And one of the early things where it really showed the benefit of working across party, and this again might sound a strange story, and I'm back to alcohol, I'm afraid, but there was the European Parliament, or the European Union, was passing legislation about the movement. I can't remember the correct name of the legislation, but it was about the movement of chemicals, dangerous chemicals. And because of the strange definition, whiskey was going to be caught up in that definition. And so whiskey tankers would have actually been caught by this design really to stop petrol and diesel and other such things moving around. And we only discovered this at the 11th hour, but we were able to stop it because at that time we had representatives in the four biggest groups. The European People's Party had the Conservatives in it, Socialists and Democrats had Labour in it, the Liberals had the Liberals in it, and the Greens had this, Green EFA had the Scottish National Party in it. And so each of us were able to go, we were all able to go to our own groups. And because it was a cross-grouping, because there was four groups involved, we managed to stop this at the 11th hour. I mean, Alyn will know, normally when something goes through committee and it gets to the chamber, it's very difficult to change the position, but we managed to do that because of cross-party collaboration.
Okay, can I ask you, Alyn, do you remember when you first met David at Parliament? Had you known each other beforehand?
It was one of the hustings for the 2004 election. It was 2004 I got in, so I never knew the MEPs when we had individual constituencies. I only had an individual constituency when I got to Westminster. And it's exactly as David says, the fact that you're actually cohabiting means that you have to cooperate to a much greater extent than you otherwise would. And whisper it low, there was actually a bit of a degree of coordination amongst the MEPs in terms of who was on which committee. And there was a time where we had 4 of Scotland's MEPs were sitting on the Fisheries Committee, which I don't think in any organigram would make much human resources sense, but politically every party felt the need to be there. But that changed, and when there was a Scottish MEP on a particular committee, and David was a real leading expert in international trade, and there was a number of times where we'd get a question would come in, and I wouldn't actually go to my Green colleagues. I would go to David's office and say, well, what's the crack with this? Is there something that we can row in behind? Because by and large, when it's a technical small p matter, there's not really an ideological thing to it. It's about, well, what can we do to get a result? And often within the Green EFA group, we sat with the Greens, and important to stress, we were not a Green MEP group. We were allied with them, and we were always on the pragmatic end of the group, and trying to get something done was always a thing. But the Scottish MEPs really did work well together because we were sharing the same space.
And Dave, I mean, like, did it ever, did you ever think like he's SNP? I mean, did that occur to you on a day-to-day basis, or was it just kind of left at the door, really, or how was that managed?
I think by and large it was left at the door, and it's probably important here to mention that it wasn't just Labour SNP cooperation. When Elspeth Atwill, the Liberal MEP, was a member, she was very, very cooperative with all of us. And John Purvis, sadly the late John Purvis, was a great supporter. And again, Alyn talked about trade. I mean, when I had an economic and monetary affairs issue, and John was an expert in that, I would go to John and say, can you tell me a bit more about this? And he was always very helpful. And again, because of his interest in that area, he used to bring Scottish bankers and financial people across. He would always invite Alyn, myself, and the other Scottish MEPs to meet with those people. There was no sense of clannishness. Obviously, come an election, you're competing for votes, you're in an election campaign, and sadly, that's the impression that people then get of your 5 years. They think that's how you act over the 5 years, but actually, the election campaign is an exception to the rule in terms of how we work together.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, so I mean, like, in some ways, it sounds like there was never, which is something you'd expect from growing up. It's not an issue, like you believe one thing, Alyn, about the future of Scotland and the UK. David, you believe another thing. I mean, since you're not having constitutional, these things don't arise at the European Parliament. It's just, it's kind of, who cares?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too glossy about make it sound too perfect. I mean, there were times, and Struan Stevenson, who I like a lot, but had an occasion to go off and do, I guess the only way to describe it is anti-European or populist stories. I mean, I remember falling out with Struan over a story about bagpipes. There was a piece of legislation about noise in the workplace, and Struan extrapolated from that the bagpipes would be banned. And I remember confronting him on that and saying, "Come on, Struan, you're talking absolute nonsense. This is just absolute garbage. Stop doing it." But he wouldn't stop doing it, of course, because he got a lot of press coverage for it, and that happened. I mean, so it wasn't always sweetness and light, but by and large, we got along, we worked together, and we managed to cooperate on all the big issues, and that's probably the key thing. It was the big issues we were able to work together on.
Do you ever remember? Neither of you remember Boris Johnson and his time as Telegraph reporter there? Do you, David?
I do, and I can tell you a story. I don't know if you're asking this because I've already told you the story before or not, but
no, but I hope it's a good one. Was he as big
it is a good one because it's very much in the bagpipes side. I didn't know Boris very well, but occasionally a group of us, including journalists, and Boris was a Telegraph journalist at that time, would go out and eat. And there was a group of us, probably about a dozen of us, quite a big table. And one of the people at the table was the UK expert on food additives. And he was there for a meeting of the specialised committee, deciding what chemicals should be added to the list of banned products. So it was a secondary, or it gets very complicated in European legislation because the treaties are primary and other stuff's like, so tertiary legislation or whatever. But they were having a meeting to discuss any new chemicals that should be added. And this guy mentioned this chemical, name of which I can no longer recall. And Boris, I suppose rather cleverly, said, "So what is it used for?" And the guy said, "Well, it's used in prawn crisps, for example." So Boris then got weeks and weeks of coverage about how the EU was going to ban prawn crisps. And the trouble with these stories is I still get people telling me the EU banned prawn crisps, despite the fact for the last 40 years they've still been available in the shops.
Yeah, I think they're hideous. I think they should have banned prawn crisps.
Probably should have.
I think we would still be in the EU if they had banned prawn crisps. But that's just a personal thing. Could I ask you just on the issue about obviously the different perspectives you come to? Do you think because you work together, then that gives you a greater understanding of the other side, and in this, I suppose that's not so much a, it always strikes me as it's always cast as a very binary issue, the whole kind of Scotland independent, Scotland part of the UK, in that Westminster context, as it's either one or the other, and you can't, do you think it helps you find common ground working together, to borrow the phrase of the title of the webinar?
I think there needs to be firstly a willingness to accept that somebody with a different point of view has a legitimate stake in the conversation, and that's where, particularly on the EU debate over the last 20 years, and David and I both had a ringside seat as it was happening. It used to be jokey fun that the EU is going to ban mince, was another one of Struan Stevenson's classics, that the steak tartare that they eat over in Brussels, but we don't have that in Scotland. And there was always a knowing wink to camera with Struan, and he knew that it was always a bit of banter. But then it got shriller and shriller and nastier as the iterations of it became more about immigration, more about globalization's not working for you, freedom of movement is undercutting your wages. That was where UKIP, the Brexit Party reform, it's the same continuum. They started to harness that sense of otherness, that sort of they're not really looking out for you, and that became something else. And there was an element of that happened in the Scottish constitutional debate as well. And I told my hands, I deplored it when I saw it from anybody from my side. And ultimately, it is a binary choice. It's, do you want Scotland to be an independent nation or not, or an independent state or not? And there could have been at some point a third option. Gordon Brown had a paper before the last UK election that had a few things in it that were interesting. The possibility of directly elected mayors, and that sort of stuff. There are things that we could do with the devolution settlement, but my party's position is clear, and to an extent, we're open to any other thing that's going to take us towards where we want to get to. But we know where we want to get to. We want to be a state like Ireland, a state like Denmark, within the EU, within NATO. But we're open to other points of discussion on that. I mean, full fiscal autonomy used to be a debate. It's not a debate so much anymore. We had the Smith Commission after the 2014 referendum. But where there was a space for something that could have been different after 2014, the proximity of the Brexit referendum just 18 months later shut all that down. And that, to an extent, superseded the discussions that were bubbling away about more powers, devolution within Scotland. I'm strongly of the view that we should massively reboot local government and actually make it local and government. Because at the moment, an awful lot of local government is about administering nationally, however you define it, set targets. But all of that stopped because Brexit just sucked all the energy out of that discussion. So the constitutional debate within Scotland got kind of stuck because of it.
Yeah.
And because there was so much uncertainty about the UK's constitutional future, if we'd said, right, we're going to go for independence, what would the border of Carlisle have looked like? Because we didn't know what the border at Calais was going to look like.
Yeah.
So that whole development got stuck for a number of years, and perhaps there's a chance now to get back to some of the shades of grey within it.
Well, absolutely. And David, I mean, like we discussed as well beforehand about that opportunity, because Europe unites all of us, right? I mean, we're all here, and the plurality, I suppose, of the Scottish public, the majority of the Scottish public are united that they want Scotland in whatever form back in Europe. I mean, it's these areas where we can work together. I think you highlighted there that EMiS put in a shared submission to Scottish Parliament recently. And that was obviously, done with consultation with yourself and with Alyn there on that. I mean, that's the kind of things that we should be working on together, isn't it, David?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think there's short, frankly, probably also medium-term strategies here and long-term strategies. The long-term strategy probably is potentially still what divides us, whether we should be part of the European Union as independent Scotland or part of the United Kingdom. But in the short to medium term, what we've got to do is build the case for being in the European Union, and to ensure that we have the best possible representation, the best possible linkage with Europe that we can outside the European Union at the present time. And the point you mentioned about the joint submission that Alyn and I signed and you authored in terms of the internal market, the UK internal market, and the Scottish Government keeping pace with European legislation, is a very good example. Because firstly, if Alyn had simply sent a letter saying the UK Government should give up the UK internal market legislation that Boris Johnson passed, then Labour government might think, well, that's SNP trying to score points. If I'd just written to the SNP, to the Scottish Government, and said, you need to do more in terms of keeping pace with European legislation, they would say that's David Martin, just causing political mischief. The fact we've written the letter together means neither government hopefully can say, or maybe they'll say it of both of us, but hopefully they'll say it of neither of us.
Excellent. I know. Can I just ask, very quickly though, in terms of the before we get on to what we should be doing, the legislative process in Europe is very different, then, isn't it? In terms of the whipping system that you have in Westminster, and it kind of leads again to kind of like a different kind of result. Would that be fair to say?
Very much.
Or,
sorry.
Or either of you.
Well, I would say very much so. And again, it's a discussion that you and I have had before, David, but I think it's worth reiterating, and it is quite difficult to get this across, but the Westminster Parliament is undoubtedly more powerful than the European Parliament as an institution, if you take the two institutions. And it's more powerful because it elects a government. But that same power is its weakness. And again, Alyn has direct experience of this, so he can contradict me if I'm wrong. But in my view, the Westminster Parliament is not a legislative parliament, despite what we see, despite the fact that it has revising committees and passage of legislation in the end. It really, I'm exaggerating slightly, but it's not much more than a rubber stamp for the executive. So it has to pass the executive's legislation because it put that executive in power. There is no executive in the European system. There's no government of the European Parliament. And so individual MEPs, in my opinion, have far more influence than individual MPs. So it's a convoluted argument, but the Westminster Parliament more powerful than the European Parliament, but I would argue within these parliaments, the individual MEPs have far more influence than individual MPs. And the assisted dying bill is kind of the exception that proves the rule. It's very rare for a member of the Westminster Parliament to be able to get legislation through Parliament. Whereas we, as Alyn has kind of indicated in terms of the way we build up expertise, We, through our committee work, become rapporteurs, individual subjects. We shape and fashion legislation through the European Parliament. And most of us can, at the end of our time, point to pieces of legislation that would not be as they are without our input. And I would say, I don't know, I'm exaggerating perhaps, maybe 75% of MPs will never be able to say that.
Yeah, Alyn?
I think it's higher than 75%, to be honest. It staggered me when I got to Westminster, the extent to which in Brussels I knew what I was there for. I was a legislator. My job was to pass good law with 750 other people and to make sure that Scotland's interests were represented within that legislative process. And there was various bits at the sausage making machine that you can chip away at it and get things in and take things away. And you had to build coalitions to that. You had to win your arguments, but there was considerable power in actually doing that. No, okay, maybe there wasn't a lot of scrutiny. Maybe much of it wasn't front of house in the consciousness of the people of Scotland or the UK or Europe, but it was significant. It was important. In Westminster, it staggered me the extent to which so many MPs had damn all interest in the legislative process. It was about politics. It was about winning the vote. It was about the intrigue. It was about who's up, who's down. The amount of MPs who referred to losing their job, having lost a seat in government. You know, being the MP wasn't the job. Being the minister was the job. Being on the front bench was the job. And it was soul destroying for me, I have to say. But so much of what Westminster was about was rather self-appointed as the cockpit of the nation. You know, we're the crucible of where we think about the big thoughts of what's going on in the day-to-day in the nation's psyche, however you define the nation. Where I was used to a legislature and making law and getting into the weeds of how it worked, and the trooping through the lobbies that the Westminster, the House of Commons MPs do, that's deciding big points of principle rather than nitty-gritty detail. At the European Parliament, when we're having a voting session in Strasbourg, you're battering through hundreds, often more, votes on individual points of detail. But that's where the influence is actually made as a parliament. So the European Parliament is a legislature in a way that Westminster isn't so much. But the Westminster Parliament has a much higher profile and, of course, relevance to the UK government, because that's where the national UK debating framework is. But they're not the same thing.
Yeah, okay. I want to move on to then. I mean, like, it's almost the meat of the issue here, because I know the questions are coming in, but a couple of things I want to, before we go to the questions. Firstly, is to kind of just discuss very light. I mean, like, there are problems in Europe at the moment, as there are everywhere. You know, what can be done, do you think, to stem this rising far right tide? The issue in France, is this worrisome for the European project, or do you think it will weather it well?
Well, I think it's worrying for politics because it's essentially anti-establishment. That worries me slightly less, but it's a sign of frustration that people don't think the system is working very well for them. It's well documented now, lots of articles and discussions on this, that people, this is really the first generation, probably since the Industrial Revolution, is likely to be worse off than its parents. So you have an incredible frustration about the fact that the system does not seem to be serving the interests of the people, and that's been reflected, I would say, less so in the European system than in the individual national governments in the member states. But of course, the member states collectively make the European system. This might be slightly controversial, but I actually think there's an opportunity for us here, because I mentioned that some of this is anti-establishment. We are now anti-establishment because we're trying to change the system. We're trying to get us back into the European Union. So I think there's an opportunity for the European movement to say it's us that's trying to, we're the disruptors now. We're the people who are trying to stir up the status quo, and we're stirring the status quo up by trying to get us back into the European Union. And I think that would have an appeal to people, because they're clearly not happy with the way politics are anywhere across Europe at the present time. And the current French crisis shows there's no easy answer. And there's when you watch the BBC World News, they have a clip, various clips, but among their clip, one of the promos they have is a clip of Tony Blair saying that the populists, I highlight the problems, the Democrats should be finding the solutions to the problems. That's not a very good paraphrase of what he says, but that's essentially what he says. And that's where we should be offering a solution. One of the ways to get the British economy growing is get us back into the European Union. One of the ways of giving people more opportunities in their life is allow them to travel across the European Union and allow people from Europe to come here. One of the ways of improving our health service is to allow people from Europe to come here and be part of our health service through nursing and doctoring and so on. So we've got to project ourselves as the solution to a problem, and if you like, maybe a little bit anti-establishment as well.
Okay, well, Alyn, can I just come into, I feel a sense of impatience I see on the chat there. I want to know, people want to know what we're going to do to get us back into Europe. What are the steps that we can take? What's our pathway for Scotland, Alyn, to get us back in?
Well, it's largely following on from what David's saying about we need to be the anti-populists, but that doesn't mean we can't use some of their tactics. And I think we do need to have a better story to tell. I think that the way that the Democrats lost the last US election, albeit on a very, very narrow basis, but they still lost. The French crisis, the German government collapsing as well. It's not difficult to find bad news stories, but I would swap Germany's problems for ours in a heartbeat. And look at Ireland, the result that happened just over the weekend there, where you saw a pretty stable continuing coalition, albeit there's shades of grey around the edges. And again, I would swap Ireland's budgetary issues for ours in a heartbeat. So you've got to use the fact that we are a cross-party, non-party organisation, where there's certain things that we can all just check at the door because it's not a constructive argument to have about whatever shades of disagreement we've got. Let's get on to the main event. And that's about broadening the membership of European Movement in Scotland. That's about reaching out to the business community to get them more reassured that there is an argument worth making. Because a number of business folks that I've been speaking to over the months and years, it's like, well, it's going to be what it's going to be anyway, so I don't want to get the snash that I'm going to get. We need to be much sharper in terms of how the media landscape works these days as opposed to how it did 10 years ago. And I'm guilty of this myself. I still think in press releases rather than TikTok videos. We were advised by the security people at Westminster that don't have a TikTok account because it's so full of malware and stuff that gets onto your computer and I don't barely even understand how it works, never mind anything else. But we are seeing people consuming their information in vastly different ways than we did 10 years ago. And it's much more about factoids and sound bites, and we cannot just leave that space empty. We've got to get into it. We've got to have the compelling stories. And the story for me is Scotland or the UK, and actually I can interchange the both quite happily in terms of getting back into the EU. Tell me a way that the UK is going to do this, and then I'll happily swing in behind that, as I think I did since 2016. The peace in Northern Ireland was grievously undermined by the Brexit process. There's a lot of people over in Northern Ireland feeling a lot more sensitive than they should be about the Windsor framework and the protocol right now. In Scotland as well, we've got a keen constitutional debate, but EU membership will take us all the way back into borders mattering that bit less. And the economic prosperity that we're all needing. I mean, ultimately, populism doesn't do that well if people are feeling happy and secure and prosperous. If people are not feeling happy and secure and prosperous, they're vulnerable to the easy answers and the snake oil salespeople.
Okay, well, I'm going to go to the questions now. I'm going to go through the question list on the Q&A function. I mean, we'll try and be brief because there's quite a few to get through. Kenny Gilchrist was the first at 7:05. Straight in there, Kenny, well done. Will Scotland be in the EU as a full member before the rest of the UK? As in England, there are no political parties selling a policy to rejoin the EU. Sir Keir seems very wet. Well, maybe I'm going to put that to David. And in some ways, surely, I mean, it must be possible to see even from a pro-union, pro-UK union, but pro-European perspective, that it's a lot more positive, the mood music up in Scotland towards the EU, and it might well drive us first in. How would you respond to that, David?
Well, firstly, of course, I accept the premise that Scotland, because the evidence is there, Scotland is far more pro-European than the rest of the United Kingdom. particularly the English part of the United Kingdom. Will we get in before the rest of the UK? I think that there are too many variables there. Firstly, I noticed Fiona in the chat said that, yeah, fine, David, you're talking about being the anti-establishment, but there's nobody to vote for if you're the anti-establishment because none of the major parties are in favour of European Union membership. Well, that changes. I mean, I was, as I mentioned earlier, elected to the European Parliament in '84, and there were 40-something, 49, I think it was, but it doesn't matter precisely, Conservative MEPs, and I would say 48 of the 49. There was only one that I knew of who was not pro-European. The Thatcher government was pro-European at that time, so the Tories was a very pro-European party. By '87, Labour was a very pro-European party and remained so for a long time. Vice versa, the SNP at one time were not in favour of European Union membership, but now are strongly in favour of it. So parties change, and I think our job as a cross-party group is to have influence in as many parties as possible and try and shift the dial within the parties and between the parties.
You can ask though, Dave. I mean, I suppose what would be the catalyst? I mean, like, look, so Keir might be wet, but we all know he's a pro-Europe. I mean, they're all pro-Europeans, right? The Labour Party is dominated by pro-Europeans. What will give them the courage to come out on the right side of this argument? What do you think? What catalyst will do that?
I don't think there's any single issue or item that will change it, but what will change it is public opinion. And that has to be built, and it'll have to be built very slowly. But public opinion is what will change it eventually. And I think that is the job of the European movement, is to continue to show the benefits of European Union membership, not just the economic benefits, but the cultural, the education, the security benefits, just to keep, and environmental, of course, benefits as well, and just keep pumping away, pushing it on those issues, and hopefully change the agenda. It's going to be a long haul. I'm no doubt about that. And the other thing we should bear in mind, and this is why I think we need a big consensus. We don't need one political party or even two political parties. We need a broad consensus, because at the moment, if this current Labour government turned around and said we're going to apply to rejoin Europe tomorrow, there is a very serious possibility that the European Union would say no, simply because they were very damaged by the Brexit withdrawal process, and they do not want to go through it again. So they'd want to make sure that Britain had a, if you like, a European future guarantee before they allowed us back in. That the prevailing view in Britain was to be part of the European Union, or Scotland for that matter.
All right. Okay, shall I go through some more of these questions here? Is that okay? I read Peter Glissoff says, which I think is a rhetorical question, would it not be better for all of the UK if Scotland were to leave the UK Union for a better European future? Why don't we just, I think that's an interesting rhetorical point. I don't think you're going to get many insights from that question. I think we know how both of our panelists are going to respond to that. The next question says, the webinar title mentions Scotland's European path. We addressed that. But Scotland has two possible paths to EU membership: as part of the UK waiting for it to apply to rejoin the EU in future, or joining the EU as an independent country. Is EMiS promoting both of these equally, which would make sense in light of your neutrality on the constitutional issue? Can you give examples of your campaign activities for each of these? Well, that's a tough one off the top of my head. Purely, my brain space isn't there at the moment, but we'll try and respond to that. I think from an EMiS corporate perspective, I'm sure I can give a more cogent one after the event if you email me. I mean, in terms of us working together, I say, that we had that wonderful example that David, I say, and Alyn, we talked about there, where we work together at trying to influence both the Scottish and UK governments. That's what we're doing, trying to speak to all. I mean, it's important to speak to all parties, isn't it, Alyn?
Yeah, David, I'd be pretty robust on pushing back on that. I don't think it's EMiS's role to promote or denigrate either independence or the Union. What we're about is getting back into the EU, and how we actually get there, well, we can be a bit fuzzy on that, because there's a range of views within the organisation, as there's a range of views within Scotland. My view is that if we wait for the UK to develop the political maturity, and I think David's right about the prospect of the EU saying no to a bid if it happened tomorrow. But it's even worse than that, I'm afraid. The Brits are now a minority sport within the EU. The Brits have just fallen way down the agenda, and there's discussions about defence cooperation bilaterally with Germany. There's the French bilateral treaties about people smuggling in small boats, and the UK is a major player out with the system, but it's not in the system anymore. The TCA exists. The TCA is working from a Brussels perspective tolerably well. Most of the problems are on the Brit side of the equation. Dublin is going to set what the EU thinks about all of that stuff. And look at the way that the new College of Commissioners has been organised. UK-EU relations has been downgraded. So there's a lack of an appetite because, you know, there's an energy crisis, there's war in the European continent, there's climate change, there's all sorts of stuff that is really pressing within the EU and the member states of it. So the UK doesn't get to come along and say, hi, I would like to rejoin now. Also, the deal that the UK had will not be the deal that the UK goes back into. And I think the UK in Westminster really is lacking some political maturity to get past those things like there won't be a rebate, there won't be an opt-out from the euro, there won't be an opt-out from the Justice and Home Affairs stuff in the way that there was previously. I think Scotland could actually make a better fist of getting round those issues because the Scottish Government has done so much work on what an EU accession process would look like. Now, of course, there's then the additional set of issues that we'd need to, from my perspective, win the case for independence, get a vote for independence, and win the vote for independence. And that's three other issues which some people on the call might want to get into. But I think, from my perspective, that's something I'd rather have us in control of than wait for the UK to get to a point where that's the case, given what we're seeing about just how much mileage reform is making up right now, with a very discontented UK electorate with its political class.
Thanks very much for that, Alyn. I'm going to go to another question here, just something we can all agree on, I think. And it's not prawn cocktails or Boris Johnson. It says Marlene Halliday. It says, I'm assuming you'd both be in favour of proportional voting for Westminster. Is that correct? And how would that be set up so as to work for parties who only stand in one part of the UK, i.e. SNP, Plaid, or the NI parties? What's your response to that? That's one way, I suppose, is to shift the dial on Europe to actually get a more representative parliament.
It would be a representative parliament which would have a big chunk of reform MPs in it as well, remember? But that is something that I think is necessary in order to actually take on the debate and have the debate and ventilate it properly, rather than subsume it into a discontent. So the way I'd do PR would be broadly along the same lines as Ireland, that you'd have regional constituencies of around about 6, 7, 8 members, depending on the geography, and do it on that basis. So it's not about Scotland, you know, the UK is not, well, the UK is 4 nations, but that wouldn't be how I would do that arithmetic within the House of Commons. There's no appetite, there's zero appetite for that within the UK. We saw that from Keir Starmer just yesterday, Wednesday, Prime Minister's Questions, where it's just not at the races. I would be in favour of it. The SNP's policy is proportional representation or proportional voting for everything. But as I've said, I think that delivers better outcomes. I think it delivers better politics, but I just don't see it. Because within the Westminster system, within the House of Commons, there's too many people who think that the pendulum swung our way now. Let's keep it here as long as we can.
Okay, I mean, David, do you want to come in? I'm sure you probably support proportional representation, or am I mistaken?
No, you're correct. And the only disagreement I had with what Alyn just said is I would probably want to go for something like the German system, which is very like the Scottish Parliament system. I think it's still very important to have a directly elected member that you can identify with. And I think that was one of the problems we had in the European referendum, that people did not identify with MEPs because representing the whole of Scotland meant we were often lost. So I would want a system where, yes, the Parliament ended up being roughly proportionate to the votes that were cast. And I agree with Alyn that, yes, you would have some probably quite unsavoury people in that Parliament if it was PR, but you don't solve smallpox by painting over the spots. You solve it by tackling the disease, and that's the interest to start tackling the disease.
Yeah, can I just say, as an Irish person here, because I do want to clarify this for any people listening, you don't have to have a list system for PR. Alan's quite right. We have actually not regional, we have multi-seat constituencies, but they're pretty small. So you do have that connection with your TD, as they're known in Ireland, but we have a proportional system. So just want to clarify that. I mean, list systems are very good too, but just a clarification. Now, I'm going to go on to a question, I think, from Jonathan here, who's in Dunfermline. Georgia is defending its sovereignty and looking to the EU for its future. Ukraine is fighting for its very existence. Meanwhile, France and Germany, the most powerful nations in Europe, cannot form a government. Between them, Trump and Putin could soon put Europe in a vice, and populists enjoy growing support in parts of Europe. What needs to happen now to defend and restore the European vision? So I suppose at a European level, what, that enthusiasm for the European vision, what can we do?
Oh, I mean, I think you see the enthusiasm in Georgia and to some extent in Ukraine, because they see it as part of their drive for freedom and for liberty. Whereas, unfortunately, it's been allowed to be painted inside the European Union as the opposite. It's somehow the EU is constraining national governments and individuals from achieving their full possibility. So we have to we have to continue to work to show that Europe is about, firstly, reinforcing democracy by dealing with issues that can't be dealt with inside a nation state, that it's about giving people a vision of a unified future of working together, cooperating together, and it's about tackling problems like climate change that cannot be tackled inside a single country. So it's the vision is there and has been there for a long time. It just needs reiterated. And the anti-war thing, which of course people started to say, oh, you keep talking about Europe as it's a vehicle for peace. There's no wars in Europe. Why do we need a vehicle for peace? Well, I think what's going on in Ukraine has demonstrated an alternative to that point of view. My only note of caution here, I'd be interested in Alan's view on this, because we were both members of the European Parliament when the Maidan was happening in Kiev. And I think the European Union gave a false perspective to the Ukrainians at that point and gave them the idea that membership was just round the corner. And of course, they built a lot of their policies and a lot of their actions on that basis. And to some extent, they're paying a price for that now. And we haven't done enough to defend them or to help them. And I hope we're not going to make the same mistake with Georgia.
Alan, Greg, you want to come in? Yeah.
I second it. I remember 2014 when the Euromaidan was going on and Crimea was being annexed, and there was various the Polish MEPs were giving out orange scarves because it was the Orange Revolution, and we were supporting. I remember Guy Verhofstadt making a really bad speech, shaking his fist and saying, "We will support you, we will be with you," and then when the bullets started flying, nowhere to be seen, of course. And there was a real cynicism about that, and also there was all sorts of systemic problems with the Ukrainian government at the time, and the EU was so inward facing at that moment after the financial crisis. We didn't rise to the occasion, and that's my point about we need to tell a better story. And the EU not only needs to tell a better story, which is about David's point about workers uniting, my point about international solidarity in action. I like to see countries working together. I like to see that permanent structured cooperation, which is a really amazing thing. The fact that the EU exists at all is an incredible achievement and testament to the genius of the founders of that structure and the people still engaged in it. But there's people trying to break.
Sorry, but isn't that the problem in some way? Brexit was the thing that got British. We have the most dynamic European movement really across the EU now in the UK because of Brexit. When you're like you're saying about these other countries, when you don't have it, you wish you had it. And in some ways, there's to re-engage that countries is really to stress the benefits. I noticed Martin's come in the chat there saying Eurobarometer said EU has higher level of popularity than for some years. So maybe as well we need to be careful of the narrative of the story. Just because you get kind of 35% voting for the National Front or whatever it is it's calling itself these days in France, 65% of people aren't voting for that? And maybe, you know, we're you know, are we listening too much to, are we being driven too much by momentum of an undercurrent on the right, which will never dominate?
Well, it never dominates until it does. And
Yeah.
you don't need to go too far back where anti-EU sentiment was belittled and rubbished within UK politics. It was fringe weirdos who were cranks and obsessive and dismissed. And we didn't do that in the SNP, certainly because we had a significant element of it historically in our party. So people who wanted to get out the EU because of fisheries policy, people who wanted to get out the EU because they want independence, but they want independence totally within Scotland and not within a wider construct. So I think Scotland had a keener understanding of those sorts of dynamics. But when I'm talking about the EU telling a better story, this is where I voted for Commissioner von der Leyen in our first mandate. The Greens, the group we were in, voted against. The SNP and some of the others voted for. The Greens voted for this time round. And I think particularly in terms of Kaja Kallas as the High Representative for Foreign Policy and Marta Kos, the Slovenian Commissioner for Enlargement, I think we've got three very good female interlocutors who'll be able to actually present a better story and have a clearer narrative for what the EU actually does in its near abroad and its wider construct. But yes, there is an element, particularly within the UK press, that is actually really quite keen to highlight the negatives that the EU and EU states, and they're not the same thing, are undergoing. The French government collapsing is a major crisis for the EU, and yes, it's going to be a challenge, but there's an awful lot of countries that are not in crisis right now.
Right. I'm going to go to another question there. I hope people didn't hear my dog barking there. The joys of webinars from home. It's delightful. This is Sarah Fanat, who asked, could Alyn explain the difference we would experience being back in the EU as an independent member state? I take we would have more MEPs, and of course we would hold the presidency of the Council of Europe like every other member state. Anything else?
The big thing day to day is that we'd have a seat at the top table. We'd have a seat in the Council of Ministers, and that means that we'd be engaged in all the legislative stuff that's churning through on a day-to-day basis about all these things. The Scottish Government wants to maintain as much equivalence with the EU's developments as we can, but there's challenges to that. There's challenges to keep up with that. There's challenges of the UK Internal Market Act, and there's challenges in practical terms of just keeping up with the flow of it all. But roundabout and the allocation of seats per country in the European Parliament is worked out every election that happens. It's done according to the Cambridge digressive proportionality formula. Obviously, don't ask me to write it down for you off the top of my head, but roughly the smaller the state, the greater the representation. So with our population presently, we'd be looking at 12, 13 MEPs. We'd need to split that across Scottish regions. However we'd do that remains to be seen. So we'd have a direct say for the people in the Parliament. We'd have a direct say for the government within the Council. We'd be back in freedom of movement. The exporters and importers into Scotland, and energy is a huge, huge, huge glittering prize that the EU is putting significant funds behind. I want to see that investment coming into Scottish companies, into Scottish startups, into the universities. We're not in that room the way we need to be, and I think we could be. And I want to see the UK back in as well. But I think, and as an independent Scotland, we've got a very, very strong proposition, because so much of the potential and the things that we've got bubbling away are exactly what the EU needs. Energy is absolutely at the top of the EU's agenda, after, of course, Ukraine. And it's largely driving energy stuff as well. So we've got a huge potential to get back into the system. And we could be that good news for a European Union that kind of needs it at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to go to David on this one. This is coming from Martin via my phone. I'm just going to. What policy aspects of Europeanism unite the SNP and Labour? I mean, both of you, very quickly, if you could answer that.
Well, I think there's a lot. Firstly, social policy. I think we both believe in a strong social dimension to European policy. Regional policy. We believe that and Alyn can contradict me if I speak for him without authority here, but I think regional policy, we both believe that Europe should do its best to help lagging regions and to share resources as best as possible. We certainly agree that climate change and environmental policy should be done at a European level, because the only way to have any real chance of tackling it is through international cooperation. Global cooperation would be ideal, but we've seen what's happened at the recent climate change talks. So I think the EU is at least a starting block for that. Some of the major industrial countries of the world uniting to try and find policies to tackle these issues. I think even immigration, I think we both would want a fairly, and I use the word fairly, liberal immigration policy. We want to see free movement where possible. Obviously, we don't want illegal immigration. We don't want the gangs that are trading in people's misery, bringing people into the country. But I think we would want to see Europe restored to allowing workers to travel freely between different countries. We'd want the Erasmus program reinstated. I'm not going to give you a whole long list because I think there's far more in terms of individual policies that unite us than would ever divide us.
Yeah, Alyn, do you want anything you want to add to that?
All of that, to which I'd add only the single market. The benefits of the single market to us as a society and an economy are just vast. And the UK, Stirling Council is passing a budget at the moment. The Scottish Government proposed a budget this week. All of these budgets are in crisis, partly because of the ongoing issue that Brexit represents. And that's before there's a new package of checks being introduced on UK goods going into the EU territory that is going to just make it even more difficult for our exporters. And there's also all the rules about services, all the rules about mutual recognition of qualifications. And yes, it is all nuts and bolts stuff. But ultimately, it's meaning that it is becoming progressively more difficult to live, work, study, trade across the rest of our European continent if you're based in these islands, or if you're based in these islands that aren't the island of Ireland, which I would give our eye teeth to get the status that Northern Ireland has right now. And I think that will become clearer and clearer. And that will be one of the drivers, I think, for shifting the UK argument around that Northern Ireland being in the single market and kind of in the UK market also, those two overlapping jurisdictions is a hugely advantageous place for Northern Ireland to be and a hugely disadvantageous place for us to be.
Okay, I'm going to go to a question from Tony Fitzpatrick, and I'm going to try and not cantor, but go quickly through these final questions that we've got here. Is this one's for David, I think, because I sent one to you specifically, Alyn, earlier. Is government UK taking a timid approach through fear of the Daily Mail, and if so, how can that be best tackled by us all? So yeah, what can we do to help them gain more courage, I suppose?
Well, firstly, again, sadly, I agree with the premise that it is to do with public opinion, not just the Daily Mail, but I think they are scared of public opinion. They're scared to seem to be reneging on the referendum. I think, firstly, we have to point out that a referendum passed by such a narrow majority and a minority of the population doesn't hold much validity, and it didn't stop the anti-Europeans after the 1975 referendum. That was never seen as sacrosanct and it should never be changed. So why should this referendum never be changed? So I think just by, again, no single answer, no single issue. It's simply by campaigning, making the case for the European Union. And again, I made this point at the time of the budget. I think EMiS did. I think maybe you even personally, David, made it. The dog that didn't bark in our budget, the UK budget I'm talking about here, not the Scottish budget this week, was the fact that the government was so constrained because our economy was down 5% by not being part of the European Union. And if we had been part of the EU and the single market, we could have been doing much more in that budget. We could have avoided some of the tax increases that were required and spent more money in public services. And making these points is the only way we're going to shift the dial, I think.
Yeah, I'm actually interested that you talk about that inviolate nature of the 2016 referendum. For reference, if anybody wants to know how nuts politics can get or what drives the more nationalist in Ireland, it's that they think that the 1918 vote it hasn't been properly. I mean, they're still harking back to that. So, I mean, no doubt, like in 100 years' time, we might even see that here. Joan asks, what moves short of rejoin can be made to keep the Scottish people more closely linked to the European project? That should surely be an achievable target, which would be particularly relevant to our young people. Alyn.
I would like to see the Scottish Government being a lot sparkier on this stuff. And as with so many things about Scottish politics, our heart's in the right place, but we don't necessarily move beyond the headlines. You know, the Welsh Government has been able to create an Erasmus replacement. Now, there's issues about its financial sustainability. There's issues about what its take-up's going to be. Obviously, there's a smaller pool for Wales to be thinking about than Scotland, but we could be thinking a bit bigger. And the Scottish Government has set itself the target of maintaining equivalence with EU rules, having as many common things as we can. That's a challenge, but I've not seen many press releases about it lately. I've not seen us really talking about it. And there's a danger that all politics has an institutional vanity, be that in Holyrood, be that in the Palace of Westminster, that if it's not happening around here, it's not really that important. Yeah, there's a danger that we just lose track and lose sight. And this is a cross-party point, that so many of the political parties, pretty much all of their EU expertise was in the MEPs and the MEPs' offices. And minus the MEPs, there's that much less of a connection in every sense. And all of the UK's parties were a bit sniffy about the European political families, and some engaged better than others, my own party included. We were always a wee bit arm's length that, well, this isn't the same sort of thing. Our job's to win votes where we are rather than a pan-national thing. But we need to get past all of that, and we need to do everything we can to maintain links, be that town twinning, be that school exchanges, be that university to university, college to college, school to school, whatever it is, to make sure that we maintain that connection and that awareness. And I think domestic politicians of all parties need to be taking at least 2 trips a year over to Brussels to go and maintain those connections. The European Committee at Holyrood does a decent job of doing that sort of stuff, but not necessarily that much wider. The Scottish ministers, likewise, I'd like to see them over in Brussels particularly, but other European capitals a lot more than we are, because as we now see, the College of Commissioners has been approved by the European Parliament. The budgets are going to start rolling out. The programmes are going to start happening. The Romano Prodi, the Prodi report is going to be the basis of what the European Commission is going to put a lot of money behind. And that's energy transition. That's about smart research, commercialisation of what the universities are doing. Our people need to be all over that stuff. And I just don't think we are to the extent that we need to be. And there's a danger that the UK's debate will be narrower and shallower, because we're just losing those connections.
Okay, David, I'm going to go to you with a separate question on the basis you probably agree with Alyn on most of that.
I do, but could I just add one thing? I think there's 2 sides to this. Alyn kind of did deal with both sides. Firstly, it's keeping what Europe's up to known in Scotland, to keep the Scottish public aware of where the European Union is. But there's also, I think, and Alyn hinted at this very strongly, there are signs that Brussels, I wouldn't say losing interest, but we're losing relevance in Brussels now, because we're not there, we're not active enough. Scotland House is excellent and does a good job, but does a more technocratic job. And I think we need political representation in Brussels to really raise the profile. My former colleague, Derek Vaughan, was appointed quasi, they don't call him this, but he is known in Brussels as the Welsh ambassador to the EU. Now, the Welsh are careful not to describe him as such, but that's more or less how he's presented in Brussels. And it gives them a clout and an input that we are beginning to lack. So I think there's much more we could do in terms of presence in Brussels than we do at the present time.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I'm going to go on to this question. I think we'll just be a very quick response to this question, because it is quite theoretical. If Scotland does go it alone and vote both to rejoin and obviously choose Indy first, do you think the Carlisle border question can be tackled via a Northern Ireland-style compromise? Quick responses, please, gentlemen. Whoever wants to tackle that one
very
first.
Quick response is, it is possible, but it would require a lot of political goodwill and a lot of hard negotiations. And we don't have, I was going to say advantage, that's the wrong word, but we don't have the history of Northern Ireland, which is partly, you have to recall, is partly what drove that settlement.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go on to Dave Mackenzie's question here.
Oh,
sorry, no, Carlisle, you've got an opinion on Carlisle, Alyn. Go for it.
I do indeed. Look, the Scottish Government, in the recent paper that was published, one of the Independence white papers, now they didn't get anything like the prominence that I think they merited, because they were good, solid pieces of work. The basis of Scotland's trading relationship with the UK, absent other things changing, and there are dotted lines into the future here, none of us are clairvoyant. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement exists. That would be the basis of the ongoing relationship, and that's what Carlisle would look like. So we've got a basis already, and this is where I would like to see the UK making serious moves back into the single market as well, because that would make Carlisle that much easier. But it is something that could be managed. It is something that is being managed at the continental ports into the main EU market in the southeast of England. So there are things that have been worked on this, and we'd make that work. And the advantages of getting back into the single market would, I think, far outweigh the disadvantages of a more for goods complex border at Carlisle. But that work has been done. Do go and have a look at it.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to go to David Mackenzie's question. David's asking here, regarding two alternative routes for Scotland and the EU, one key factor is the time each route would take. I recall Sir John Curtis saying it could be more than 20 years for the UK to rejoin. If properly led and managed, an independent Scotland could start the process to join the EU in less than 5 years. Now, that's a statement. Can I just ask both of you, do you concur with the premise that it's probably going to take longer within the UK than it would were Scotland to go it alone? Just for both, I mean, it's pretty a straightforward question. David?
Yes and no, because yes, in the sense of once Scotland is independent, no, because we don't know how long it would take to become independent. So yes, if we're starting from the same starting block, I think Scotland would be in quicker. But if you're talking about getting independence and then negotiating membership, it's impossible to tell, because we don't know how long the first stage would take.
Alyn,
I'm assuming you probably agree with the premise of that question.
Well, David said yes and no. I'll say no and yes. Because how long's a piece of string? The UK rejoining the EU will have a serious set of negotiations. It's not just a question of you rock up at Brussels airport with half a dozen Frosties tokens and you're back in. You're not. The EU that the UK will be joining is different to the EU that the UK left. And the package will be different. And the UK starts from a decent basis in that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement exists. There are things to build upon. Scotland would be starting from a fresher sheet of paper, but likewise, we've been part of the TCA and the acquis communautaire for all the years we have been. I think we'd also have less existential issues about, we never had a rebate. We never had a Justice and Home Affairs opt-out. We don't greatly care. Equally, we'd drive a harder bargain on fish. And I think the people of Scotland would expect us to drive a harder bargain on fish, because it's that much more economically important to Scotland than it is to the UK. So there's two processes there that I don't think can be gainsaid in either sense. And to get to an independent Scotland, you don't get to apply to join the EU until you're an independent state. Now, you can give all sorts of earnests of this is where we're looking to get to, guys. We know the Commission pays close attention to what's going on in Scotland. But none of this can be taken for granted. And there are two ways of doing this. The Scottish Government set out a time frame that looks at round about 7 years, assuming everything goes smoothly, which we'd obviously all hope it would, because it's in everybody's interest that it does. But if we're talking about the UK, A, public sentiment moving, and B, being able to actually have the negotiation after that sentiment has moved, I think you're looking at a pretty long time frame, where the stuff that Scotland will need to deal with is much more nuts and bolts. We'd need to get to the point where we've actually passed an independence referendum in the first place, which will be, again, how long's a piece of string. But if it all goes smoothly, I think there's enough people in Scotland to have a well-developed view of such matters, and it's up to my side to make the case for that proposition, and it's up to those who would otherwise want to stick with the Union to make theirs. But if it's about EU membership, I think EMiS particularly, we can ride two horses simultaneously in this. We're in existence to get us back into the EU, and there are different ways in which we can do that, but I don't think EMiS needs to bet the house on any particular route in terms of that. There's a range of views within the organisation, within the country, and that's a good thing, I'd suggest. But I actually wouldn't accept the idea that the UK gets in faster or Scotland gets in faster. I don't think we know yet.
Well, thanks for that, Alyn. I could say I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much for the stirring support of our premise, is that we can all work together on this, and we are working all together on this. I'm going to take two more questions here. Can I point out to everybody that Jill Laurie makes a very good point there. Jill, you just came in quite late on the rural parliament issue, and it's more a point. So if people can look at the question there, they could see that. I'm going to just quickly, there's a quick question here from Alistair. I think we can deal with this very quickly, and then I'm going to end on Lauren's more substantive question. Alistair says, if the North of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland united, would it be easier for Scotland or Britain to rejoin the EU? I don't know. What do you guys think?
To be honest, I don't think it make any difference, but it'd be good for Ireland.
All right. Okay. It depends on who you ask in Ireland, can I just say?
From my point of view.
as David McWilliams, an economist, said, the people of Dunleary, which is an affluent part of Dublin, don't want to end up paying for the dole for, 500,000 Rangers supporters, I think he put it. But, that's the view in metropolitan Ireland. But I think generally you're right. Most people in Ireland would support.
View in Edinburgh West.
And Lauren then asked the question, is part of the problem that most people don't realise what we have lost through leaving the EU? How long do you think it will take?
I think people do increasingly realise on a practical level what's been lost, and this was the really significant point earlier about so much of the EU stuff was taken for granted. And that was quite deliberate on the part of the Leave campaign. I remember Daniel Hannan saying, nobody's talking about leaving the single market. That was a commitment. But there was lots of other commitments as well. If ever there was an individual who better typified here are my principles, if you don't like these, I have others. That was the Leave campaign. There was a promise for everything you wanted, and £250 million a week for the NHS. Who wouldn't vote for it? There was nothing actually put on the table as at risk. And the Remain campaign was dismissed as fear-mongering and scaremongering. And look, the sky hasn't fallen. Life continues. It's just everything's got a bit meaner, a bit cheaper, a bit narrower, a bit shallower. And I think that's a tragedy, particularly for young people. As we mentioned at the start, I did Erasmus. I did the College of Europe. I worked in Belgium. I was a rep on the Costa Brava. You'll never see that in the official bio there. I'm sharing real secrets tonight. I took advantage of my EU rights without barely thinking about them because they were just there. And then these rights have been taken away from young people, and it breaks my heart because the kids who were going to travel and work and study because they're middle-class kids who are going to do well will do well. It's everybody else that all of our lives have been made a bit more difficult. So I think people do have an awareness. What we need to fight against as EMiS, I think, and the European movement UK-wide, is that there are solutions, there are answers. The Young European Movement launched the Erasmus campaign, which I think was a great, hard-edged, focused, let's get back into Erasmus. We're not talking about freedom of movement, we're talking about the Erasmus programme. Who could object to that? And this is what I think the European movement generally needs to focus on: bread and butter things that we can win, that we can actually explain on the back of a fag packet, that we can explain down the pub and say, wouldn't it be good if we got back into that? And that's where I think EMiS's focus will be next year and UK-wide, because change happens slowly then fast. And I think we're pushing it. It's not an open door yet, but I think we are pushing it a door with an awful lot of people behind us who need to be given a bit of vision and a bit of hope.
David, do you want to add any final thoughts there?
Just very briefly. I mean, it is about identifying practical issues that we can make progress on, and in doing so, demonstrating to people what they've lost. Just before saying that, though, Alyn made the point about the sky falling, and I actually said this during the referendum campaign. I was actually criticised for it, but I actually said that our side shouldn't talk as if the sky would fall, because it wouldn't fall immediately afterwards, and people would say, oh, you were just, it would say exactly what they did say, you were scaremongering, you were exaggerating. Yeah. What we've now got to show is bit by bit the things, as rightly as Alyn says, we've lost, and there are little things like how do we tackle environmental problems, how do we work together on the environment, how do we allow our youth the opportunity to travel. And it's not just Erasmus. The EU has proposed this youth mobility scheme. I think we should push that extremely hard. And we've seen how vocal farmers can be. Let's make a populist case about the very boring sanitary and phytosanitary issues, but a veterinary agreement would allow food to move freely, which would both benefit farmers and consumers. And I think one of the key issues that we haven't still not quite made enough of is how food prices have been impacted by border controls, and how we're paying more for our food, or getting sometimes less quality food, and sometimes not being able to get certain products because of these borders in existence. And that affects consumers in their everyday life. And we need to, if we can keep hammering away at these issues, we can slowly start to change the narrative around this.
Well, look, I think we've come to the end of this session. I want to thank both of you hugely for doing this. We are absolutely blessed in EMiS to have the caliber of president and vice president that the two of you show. And what's most impressive about this is that term that seems to be very that Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart seem to be keen on, that to disagree agreeably. We're much better than that. We're better than, it's not about disagreeing agreeably. We work together. We're working together on this, and we're committed, all of us, to getting us back into the EU. So can I thank you both for joining us today? Thank everybody who came on to the webinar. I think there's details in the chat about how you can do more with EMiS, but thank you very much, both of you, and we'll see everybody very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you.